All right, in this video, we're going to talk about the evolution of economic systems. When we say evolution, we mean changes over time. And there's much debate about how or if economies evolve. So that debate is unsettled. We're going to be looking at a variety of historic thinkers and their perspectives on this topic, rather than have one concise theory to work off of. One of those thinkers was Karl Marx, undoubtedly one of the most influential philosophers, social scientists of all time. He changed the paradigm in how we think about economic evolution. Prior to Marx, there was very little focus on the concept of economies evolving. We learned a lot about how economies operate from guys like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, but their focus was more short-term, looking at a given environment and the challenges that people face, rather than looking at how that environment itself changes over long periods of time. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo are famous for analyzing the concept of diminishing returns, which essentially says if you grow the population faster than the means to feed that population, you will have famine. People will become less productive, and long term, you have subsistence and a stationary existence. So that makes economics somewhat of a dismal science because long term things look bleak. David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus were not oblivious to the fact that you could overcome these challenges. They're just acknowledging that they're real, and that if you want to feed a population, you better grow the arable land and the capital and the technology along with the population to keep from hitting diminishing returns, from hitting that wall to where people end up in poverty. The pre-Marx analysis, though, didn't involve the institutions that provide that framework for decision making. And we've already learned that these are the rules of the game, the political, economic, and social rules that we come up with to kind of guide decision making. Marx, in contrast, comes along and focuses heavily on institutions. And he's operating at a time, the mid-1800s, where he's in Europe and it's undergoing an industrial revolution. You have capitalism as a primary economic system. And from his perspective, this system is creating unfair, almost immoral outcomes that will make it unsustainable. You have to remember that Marx is witnessing capitalism at a particular period in time. That period is one of heavy industry, bigger businesses outcompeting smaller businesses, consolidating power in the hands of less and less entrepreneurs, relegating previously independent business owners to be workers in these factories, in these manufacturing plants. The jobs themselves are difficult and dangerous and oftentimes monotonous. So he doesn't like what he's seeing. Okay? Of course, he's also focused on the institutions. So he doesn't just lay blame to industrialism. He blames the system of capitalism, period, which makes this a more contentious kind of argument, because capitalism can exist in periods of agriculture, where that's the dominant industry. It can exist in periods of technology, where that's the dominant industry. It doesn't just exist with industrialization. But regardless, he sees capitalism as the overarching institutional structure, and it's therefore the problem. He's also focused on how the institutional arrangements will change over time. So it's a dynamic analysis. Even though capitalism is dominant during his era, he believes the seeds of change are there, and those seeds of change will emerge through a revolution inevitably. It may be hundreds of years, but he believes that will come. He uses a historical materialism as his framework, philosophical framework for analysis. He believes that history is a real struggle for survival, right? Dealing with the economic problem of scarcity. Marx is at his essence an economist because he recognizes that the most important challenge man faces is not having the means to satisfy his wants. He also believes the world is not static but becoming. This is why we say evolving or economic evolution. He takes a unilineal view. In other words, we're going in one direction, right? We're not going back, we're going forwards, and there's really nothing we can do about this. In this sense, it's comparable to Darwin's biological evolution. In fact, Marx was influenced heavily by Charles Darwin, but he's applying the theory of evolution to economic systems, whereas Darwin applied it to organisms and how they change over time. Both, however, believe that the change is positive, that we're becoming better. And that's an important distinction because you could evolve and be worse off, right? We might call that devolving, but from the standpoint of change, you can change into a lesser form. But Darwin didn't see that, right? Darwin saw organisms improving over time in terms of their viability and ability to deal with life. Marx sees economic systems evolving in a way that's better. And allowing people over time to better deal with the challenges of life. The fundamentals of Marxism are as follows. His labor theory of value says that all commodity value comes from labor. Okay? In other words, there is no value from other resources. If you pay $4 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks, then according to Marx, that $4 of commodity value should all go to the workers at Starbucks. Any of that $4 that doesn't go to the workers is called surplus value, and it's unfairly expropriated from the worker. It belongs to the worker because they're the only ones responsible for the production of value. But we know in a capitalist system that doesn't happen, right? We know that some of that $4 is going to go to the stockholders in the form of profits. Some of it's going to go to the people that lent money to Starbucks to get the equipment, right? Interest. And some of it's going to go to pay the landlord that Starbucks sits on, rent. So of that $4, maybe workers get $1 and $3 goes to these people. Well, from Marx's standpoint, that is expropriated. It's taken away from the worker. The system itself is allowing for the worker to be exploited by unfairly extracting what is rightfully theirs, $4, to other people. Marx talks about the base of society. This is the economic system that determines the productive relationships entered into. For example, in a capitalist system, the base of society would be the employer and the employee, because those two have to enter into a relationship in order to be productive. From his perspective, a history of inferior economic systems has generated class conflicts that are the primary causes of human hostility, misery, and evil. Capitalism is just one of many inferior economic systems that have done this. It brings together the employee with the employer, and that relationship is one of power imbalance. So it creates conflict that has to be resolved over time. But it is the conflict that Marx is concerned with. And he therefore wants to evolve past those economic systems that create class conflicts, power imbalances between one group and another. He also references the structure of society. This is the religion, the art, the government, the law, the education. Notice that the base of society is the economic system, but the superstructure is kind of everything else. He believes that these are determined by the dominant economic classes. For example, in capitalism, the religion, the art, the government, the laws, the education would all promote the idea that individualism is good, that upward mobility and opportunity is possible, that income imbalances are a reflection of talent and hard work, things like that. But for Marx, it's a means that the dominant classes use to subordinate the masses. It's a ruse to get them to comply with a system that is not in their best interest. Okay? The forces of production and the relations of production are both integral to understanding the evolution that Marx believes will occur. Productive forces naturally occur over time. We get better at producing things. Go back in history, we relied almost exclusively on our labor to satisfy our needs. Then we learned to harness land, domesticate animals, things like that. Then we built machinery, industrial periods. And today we use technology. It's like natural tailwinds to advance us towards higher standards of living in the future. But then you have the relations of production. These are the relationships people must enter into in order to survive and produce. Recall that the employee had to enter into a relationship with the employer in order to survive in the system of capitalism. Well, these can become headwinds to productivity. That's what economic evolution is all about to Marx. It's qualitative changes in the economy that occur because the relations of production start to block the forces of production. And that leads to a revolution and the ultimate attainment of a higher level of relations. So in capitalism, we reach a point where the forces of production are blocked by the relations of production between the employee and the employer. The class conflict that is immiserating the employee becomes too great for him to tolerate. So it cultivates a revolution that eventually overthrows the entire economic system, creating qualitative changes and at the attainment of a new higher level of relations, which we'll see for Marx is socialism. All right, let's move on and talk about his theory of history. Marx looks at all of history of mankind and details out how these relationships have blocked the forces at certain junctures in time, leading to a new economic system. And recall that it's also a better economic system. So we are moving towards something better, less conflict, less power in the hands of some at the expense of many. The longest time frame that people survived on this planet were under a system of primitive communalism. Okay? Labor-intensive production, hunting and gathering, began about 200,000 years ago. I mean, anthropologists will debate this, but anywhere from 50,000 to 500,000 years ago. When you think of Homo sapiens, right? The kind of society where people lived in small tribes, and there is no surplus value created here. Everyone just works and production is rapidly consumed. Survival is the primary motive to produce, right? You're going out and hunting and gathering so you can live another day. Excess production, if there is any, is shared with others in the community. The level of productivity is high enough to sustain life. We wouldn't be here if they didn't, but it's low enough to where the accumulation of material items isn't occurring. So everything is pretty much consumed. There's no private property. There may be some trivial items like clothing, adornments, that kind of thing, but no real need to assign property rights to things because they're not accumulating things on any large scale. There's no political system. It's not necessary. You have small populations. Social stigma, culture, values are going to be sufficient to incentivize people to align with the best interests of society. We don't need a system of incarceration or penalties to get people to comply. And then no class system that is social hierarchies. You could have tribal leaders, elders, sages, etc. Often in these environments, wisdom matters a lot. So the longer you've been here, the more wisdom you have. So older people may have some power in the hierarchy over younger people. There's no rich, poor, or political class and non-political class, that type of thing. Okay, that's it for this video. We'll pick up in the next one. Thanks.